I want to begin with the single most common question people ask when they start looking for their family in U.S. records. If Black Americans came from Africa, why can't we find people born in Africa in the census? That question sounds logical, but it assumes the census was designed to preserve identity. It wasn't. The first thing to understand is this. The U.S. Census was never built to document enslaved African origins. It was built to count labor, property, and political power. And once you understand that, the confusion disappears.
So you're saying people aren't missing something, they're using the wrong tool? Because folks look at the census like it's a family album.
Exactly. The census wasn't a family album. It was a control ledger. Before 1870, most enslaved Black people were not listed by name at all. They were counted numerically under the name of the enslaver. No personal surnames, no African birthplaces, no ethnic identities. That erasure happened on paper long before emancipation.
Clarification. If a record system does not include a field for place of origin, that information cannot appear later. Absence of data is not evidence of absence of people, it is evidence of system design. Humans frequently confuse these two concepts.
Thank you, Luma. Now here's the key historical shift that matters. The 1870 census is the first U.S. census where formerly enslaved Black Americans appear as individuals listed by name, age, sex, and birthplace. That is why genealogists call 1870 the brick wall. But by the time that wall comes down, something else has already happened. The United States legally ended the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. That means by 1870, the youngest Africa-born person brought here legally would be at least 62 years old. Most Africa-born people would be far older, and many had already died under brutal conditions of slavery. So when people ask why they don't see Africa in the 1870 census, the answer is not mystery, it's math. It's mortality. It's policy.
So by the time the government finally bothered to write people down as people, most Africa-born elders were already gone.
Yes, historical estimates show that well under 1% of the Black population in 1870 was Africa-born, likely closer to 0.1% to 0.3%, about 1 to 3 people per thousand. In some states, the number was effectively zero. That's why Africa doesn't appear clearly in later census records. Not because Africa wasn't there, but because the system erased it first, and time finished the job.
Summary. The census records what the state needs, not what families deserve. When identity is not administratively valued, it disappears from the archive.
And this is where many modern arguments go wrong. People see absence in the record and assume replacement, fabrication, or fraud. But absence here is structural, designed, predictable, documented. This is the brick wall. In Act 2, we're going to walk through what happened between 1808 and 1870, and why the percentage matters more than people realize. To understand why Africa disappears from census records, we have to talk about time. Not symbolism, not identity debates. Time. Because the question isn't whether Africans were here. The question is how many Africa-born people could still be alive by the time the census finally wrote Black Americans down as individuals. And the answer is very few. The United States legally banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. That date matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. Because the census that finally names formerly enslaved people is 1870. That's a 62-year gap. So let's do the math carefully. If someone was brought from Africa in 1808 and they were 10 years old, they'd be 72 in 1870. 20 years old, they'd be 82. 30 years old, they'd be 92. Most people enslaved and transported were young adults, not children, and many arrivals occurred well before 1808, especially in the late 1700s. So by 1870, the overwhelming majority of Africa-born people had already died under slavery or were elderly and extremely few in number. This is not speculation. This is demographic reality.
So when people say, I don't see Africans in 1870, they're expecting to see what exactly? Thousands of 90-year-olds?
Exactly. They're expecting the census to show something that time itself had already erased. And historians have estimated this. By 1870, well under 1% of the Black population in the United States was Africa-born. Most credible estimates fall between 0.1% and 0.3%. That's 1 to 3 people per thousand. In many states, the number was effectively 0.
Statistical clarification. When a subgroup drops below 1%, it often disappears visually in records, especially when the subgroup is elderly, the subgroup is unevenly distributed, and the data collectors are inconsistent. Human expectation often ignores scale.
And scale is everything here. Let me say this plainly. The absence of Africa-born people in the 1870 census is not surprising. It is expected. If Africa did appear prominently in 1870 records, that would be historically suspicious. Now here's where people make the next mistake. They assume that because Africa-born people are rare in 1870, Africa must not be part of the family story. But ancestry doesn't vanish when the first generation dies. It passes forward. Remember this. About 388,000 enslaved Africans were brought directly to what became the United States. That number is small compared to Brazil or the Caribbean, but it is not small in human terms. Those 388,000 people became parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. And because slavery in the U.S. was hereditary, their children were enslaved at birth. No new importation was required for the population to grow.
This is the part people struggle with. They hear only 388,000 and think something doesn't add up.
Right. But that's because they're missing how the system worked. In the United States, enslaved people were forced to reproduce. Children inherited enslaved status automatically. Families grew internally. By 1860, there were about 4 million enslaved people in the U.S., not because millions were imported, but because law turned human reproduction into population expansion.
Demographic note: population growth through natural increase does not require continuous immigration. In fact, the U.S. enslaved population is historically notable for growing without large post-1808 importation. This pattern is well documented.
So when someone asks, if we came from Africa, why don't we see Africa in the census? The correct answer is because by the time the census recorded Black Americans as people, Africa-born ancestors were generations back. Their identities were never written into federal records, and their descendants were born here. The census reflects where people were born, not where their ancestors came from. Those are not the same thing.
So the census is telling the truth, just not the truth people think it's supposed to tell.
Exactly. It's telling you, this person was born in Georgia, not this person's great-grandmother was taken from West Africa in 1765. That information lived in oral history, not federal paperwork.
System reminder: records reflect administrative priorities, not ancestral completeness. Misreading scope leads to false conclusions.
This is why the claim Africa was a lie because it's not in the census collapses under scrutiny. The census was never designed to preserve African identity for enslaved people. It was designed to count bodies, and once those bodies became legally free, the system recorded their present, not their stolen past. Let me lock this in with one sentence. By the time Black Americans appear as individuals in census records, most Africa-born ancestors were already gone, and their identities had been erased by design decades earlier. That's not emotional. That's historical.
So Act 2 is basically saying the timeline itself explains the silence.
Yes, and in Act 3, we're going to tackle the next misconception. If all of this happened, where are the slave ships? We're going to talk about commerce, disposal, records, and why shipwrecks are not the evidence people think they are. Now we need to address the claim that shows up every time this history is explained. If millions were enslaved, where are the slave ships? That question sounds reasonable until you understand what slave ships actually were. They were not monuments. They were not sacred artifacts. They were commercial cargo vessels. And commerce does not preserve its tools once they stop making money.
Okay, but people hear no ships found and think that means something didn't happen. They're expecting wrecks, proof, something you can point to underwater.
That expectation misunderstands both maritime history and how evidence works. Most slave ships were wooden, heavily reused, renamed repeatedly, repaired until unsafe, then dismantled, sold off, or repurposed. They were not designed to last centuries, and there was no incentive to preserve them, only incentive to erase them.
Material science clarification. Most transatlantic slave ships were wooden hulls. Wood submerged in salt water deteriorates rapidly unless buried in anaerobic conditions. Many wrecks collapse into debris fields within decades. Absence of intact hulls is expected, not suspicious.
Exactly. And here's another piece people miss. Slave ships were often reused for many voyages. A ship might transport enslaved Africans one year, carry sugar the next, haul timber after that. Names changed, owners changed, flags changed. So even when a wreck exists, identifying it requires construction analysis, port records, insurance documents, and court cases. Shipwrecks are supplementary evidence, not primary proof.
So historians aren't out here saying, no wreck, no slavery.
Correct. Historians don't require the Mayflower wreck to prove colonization, Viking ships to prove Norse travel, Roman boats to prove Mediterranean trade. They rely on records, and the transatlantic slave trade is one of the most documented commercial systems in human history. Here is where the real evidence lives. Shipping manifests documenting departures and arrivals, port customs records tracking cargo, insurance policies that listed enslaved people as insured property, admiralty court cases, especially after 1808, seizure records from anti-slavery patrols, bills of sale and estate inventories, population data showing growth patterns impossible without importation. These records were created by governments, merchants, insurers, courts, not by abolitionists trying to make a point. They were created to make money and enforce law.
Evidence convergence note. When independent record systems agree, shipping, insurance, courts, census, confidence increases exponentially. Shipwrecks are optional. Documentation is decisive.
That's why historians can say with confidence, about 12.5 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. About 388,000 were brought directly to what became the United States. Those numbers come from cross-verified records, not guesses.
So when someone says no ships found, what they're really saying is, I don't understand how historical evidence works.
That's right. And there's another reason ships don't become memorials. These vessels represented brutality, disease, death, and profit from human suffering. There was no cultural desire to remember them. They were tools, and tools get discarded. Let me say this clearly. The absence of preserved slave ships does not weaken the historical record. It confirms how disposable enslaved lives were treated by the system that profited from them. That's not mystery. That's consistency.
Logical summary. If an institution erases people on paper, it will also erase the tools used to exploit them. The pattern aligns.
And this connects directly back to our earlier acts. Census records erased African identity. Time reduced the number of Africa-born survivors. Ships were dismantled, renamed, or destroyed. Records carried the truth forward. This is why history survives in archives, not in wreckage.
So asking where are the ships is like asking where are the chains? They weren't kept.
Exactly. And in Act 4, we're going to address the number that confuses people the most, 388,000, why it's correct, why it's not small, and how law turned that number into millions of descendants. Now we need to talk about the number that stops people cold, 388,000. That's the estimated number of enslaved Africans brought directly to what became the United States. People hear that and say, that's not enough to explain millions. It is, once you understand the law.
This is where people get stuck. They hear only 388,000 and think something's missing. Because by 1860, there are around 4 million enslaved people in the US. So the question becomes, where did everyone come from?
They came from birth. And birth under US slavery was not freedom. It was inheritance. In the United States, slavery was hereditary. That means, if a woman was enslaved, her children were enslaved automatically, no matter who the father was. This principle was enforced by law for generations. So population growth did not require new ships. It required law that converted birth into property.
Legal clarification. Hereditary slavery ensures population replacement through reproduction rather than importation. Once established, the system becomes self-sustaining. This is a known demographic mechanism.
And the United States leaned into this system in a way many other slave societies did not. In much of the Caribbean and parts of Latin America, mortality was extremely high. Birth rates were low. Populations often required constant importation. In the US, enslaved people were forced into conditions that increased birth rates. Families were deliberately grown for labor and sale. Children became assets. This is not speculation. Plantation records document births alongside crop yields.
So when people say only 388,000 came here, what they're really missing is that the system didn't need more imports. It turned people into inventory.
Yes, and that's why the Black population in the US grows after 1808, even though legal importation ends. By 1790, roughly 700,000 enslaved people. 1860, roughly 4 million. That growth is mathematically impossible without natural increase.
Demographic confirmation. When immigration stops, but population rises, reproduction is the explanatory variable. No alternative mechanism fits the data.
Now here's where the misunderstanding becomes dangerous. Some people hear this and say, see, most Black Americans must not be African. That conclusion does not follow. Those 388,000 Africans were the foundational ancestors. They were the first generation. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren were born here, but their ancestry did not reset. Africa doesn't disappear because the ship stopped sailing. It passes forward biologically, culturally, and historically.
So the math works. People just don't like the answer.
Exactly. And let me be clear about something else. Even though the US received a smaller share of the transatlantic trade compared to Brazil or the Caribbean, slavery here lasted longer, expanded westward, and became deeply embedded in law, finance, and identity. The damage is not measured only in import numbers. It's measured in generations held.
Analytical note: a smaller founding population can produce a larger descendant population given high fertility, enforced inheritance of status, and multi-generational continuity. This pattern is consistent with the US data.
So let's lock this in. 388,000 explains scale of importation. Hereditary slavery explains growth. Natural increase explains millions. Records confirm the pattern. There is no gap, there is no mystery. There is no need to invent alternatives.
Which means the argument the numbers don't add up actually tells us more about the argument than the history.
Yes, it tells us the system is being misunderstood. And in Act 5, we're going to talk about what happens when people misread records and try to fill the silence with myths. We're going to talk about how to read absence without rewriting history. Now that we've walked through the records, the timeline, the ships, and the numbers, this is where everything comes together. Because the biggest mistake people make isn't asking questions, it's answering silence with invention. When someone looks at the census and says, "I don't see Africa, so Africa must be false," they're doing something very human. They're assuming absence means replacement. But in history, absence usually means erasure.
So this whole series boils down to learning how to read what isn't there, without making stuff up to fill the gap.
Exactly. So let me show you the responsible way to read these records. Responsible historical interpretation uses triangulation. That means you never rely on a single source to tell the whole story. You use three lenses together. First, records. Census data tells you who the government counted, when it counted them, and what categories it cared about. It does not tell you ethnic origins of enslaved people, African nations or languages, or ancestral identity beyond place of birth. Records are precise and limited.
Clarification: administrative records are optimized for governance, not genealogy. Expecting them to preserve cultural identity is a category error. Second, law. Law explains why the records look the way they do. Slavery was hereditary. Enslaved people were property in census logic. Importation ended in 1808. Naming enslaved people was not required. Identity preservation was not incentivized. Once you understand the law, the paperwork makes sense.
So the law didn't just shape lives, it shaped the archive.
Exactly. And finally, third, biology. DNA tells you genetic inheritance, population-level ancestry, probabilities. It does not tell you names, dates, nations, or lived experience. DNA can support the record, but it cannot replace it.
Biological data without historical context produces misinterpretation. Historical context without biological data produces incompleteness. Integration resolves both.
So when Africa doesn't appear clearly in the census, here's what it actually means. The system didn't record enslaved people as individuals. African origins were erased early. Importation ended decades before personal records existed. Africa-born elders were few by 1870. Descendants were born here. That absence is expected. It does not require an alternative origin story.
So absence doesn't mean they lied. It means they didn't write it down.
Yes, and that distinction changes everything. This is where I need to be very clear. This history should not be used to deny African ancestry, claim purity, erase indigenous suffering, or replace one truth with another. Some indigenous people were reclassified as Black. That history is real, but it is small, regional, and specific. It does not redefine Black American origins.
Ethical constraint. If a conclusion requires erasing millions of documented lives, it is incorrect.
And let me state the big picture plainly. In the United States, the vast majority of Black Americans are African descended, often with small amounts of indigenous ancestry. Some have both African and indigenous ancestry in meaningful proportions. A very small number are primarily indigenous people who were classified as Black under racial law. All of these truths coexist. Replacement myths are not repair.
So clarity doesn't erase anyone. It actually protects everyone.
Exactly. If you remember nothing else, remember this sentence. The absence of Africa in census records reflects erasure and time, not fabrication or replacement. That sentence fits the evidence.
Final synthesis. Records explain structure. Law explains motive. Biology explains inheritance. Together, they explain the silence.
This documentary wasn't about choosing an origin. It was about learning how to read history without fear. Truth doesn't need exaggeration. It doesn't need replacement. It doesn't need silence. It needs care. Thank you for staying with the complexity.